We left off finishing up chapter two, communication, teamwork, that kind of stuff. Now we're going to be getting into kind of the legal and ethical aspects in the operating room, and kind of how we document and things like that. So one of the things you got to understand is kind of the difference between what's considered to be ethical and what's like legal, right? Um, Ethics means that you're going to follow those laws, those rules, standards, or regulations, or policies, or anything. Uh, Particularly in medicine, that means we're following all those rules and stuff that are put in place by the hospital or the healthcare facility itself, right? And we do those, and the other aspect of ethics isn't just you following the rules. It's you're following the rules because it's the right thing to do, the right thing for that patient, the right thing, uh, for all who are involved, right? And that's kind of why the laws get made, or the rules and the regulations and stuff, uh, is to give us, guidance, and those people coming behind us and things like that don't have to like try and make it all up on their own. Right? Um, the law, though, is usually, laws come into being by kind of how society see things, right? It used to be back in before the 70s or 80s, cars there was cars made without seatbelts, right? Because it wasn't a law to wear seatbelts. But then after so many accidents and people dying and things like that, then they decided for people's protection, then they made it illegal for you to drive without a seatbelt. Right? Um, but that's kind of why we make laws and things like that, is we're trying to protect individuals and groups of people and things like that. Now, not all laws make sense, obviously, and they get looked at and changed or whatever. But laws are made by the government, right? They're enacted by the government, put into law by them, and then protected by also government agencies, police departments, FBI, things like that. So they go out and like enforce those laws. Um, so if you violate a law, right, you're going to have some kind of consequence, whether that means financial consequence, where you're going to have to pay some kind of fine or damages or something to somebody, or jail time, right? You actually get arrested, uh, depending on the law that you broke, whether it was a civil law or criminal law. Right? Um, many laws, especially in the OR, are pretty commonly known. We'll get into some of the things like abandonment, neglect, negligence, things like that. Some others aren't really known as well, or a little less clear, right? Like the laws surrounding like power of attorney and living will and DNR and stuff like that. But we'll get into to those. Um, Administrative law, though, these are specific government agencies that are creating these laws, right? That's like the EPA, FDA, OSHA, right? Always all with some kind of safety or protection in mind for a group, right? Like OSHA, all of theirs is about occupational safety, right? No matter what industry you work in, whether it's in the hospital or like an Amazon warehouse, or construction on the side of the road or whatever. Uh, OSHA has a set rules for each industry and set laws that tell them what they can and can't do for their to their employees, or what kind of situations they put them in, what kind of equipment and safety stuff that they have to have available to them to perform their job, that kind of thing. EPA, environmental protection, right? We're trying to make sure that we don't have companies like dumping things into local waterways, or that they're taking care of their trash and their waste, and they're handling any kind of chemicals or potentially hazardous items the way that they need to be handled so that nobody else gets hurt by those, right? And then, of course, the FDA, that's the Food and Drug Administration. These are the people who are, they check over all of our food, right? They tell us, how much percentage of, like rat tail or cockroaches or insects or stuff is acceptable to be in our food. For those who don't know, there actually is an acceptable amount of like cockroach legs that is allowed to be in food because they understand that you can't completely eradicate all of those insects and stuff. They are attracted to these places that manufacture the food and package it and all that simply because it is food. That's where they're coming to get their food too. So they allow for a little bit to be in there. But for us in medicine, we're more focused on like the drug part. They're looking at like the medications, the vaccines, and things like that. Like you probably heard of FDA quite often in the news with the release of the Moderna vaccine and some of these other vaccines now that are coming online for COVID. And they have to get this FDA approval and things like that because they need to make sure it's safe to give to the masses. But not only do we have like federal laws affecting healthcare, but each state has their own laws too, right? Some of them are regulatory in the sense of, they tell us what's our scope of practice, what we can do in our job as like an ST, right? If you're a nurse, this is the list of things that you can do. Anything outside this list is beyond your scope of practice and you can get in trouble for it. Same thing with, like STs, pharmacy techs, lab techs, all the, surgeons, that kind of stuff. They all have like a definition of what's within their scope of practice, right? And these can vary from state to state. Certain states may allow an ST, to suction or place a retractor. Most do not, but they may have a little tweak as far as what you can and can't do. And it goes for all the healthcare professions. But in order to know what you can and can't do, you access your state laws, right? So here in Florida, we're pretty standard here in Florida as far as what an ST can and can't do. It's easier to go through what we can't do. We're not allowed to suction unless directed by the surgeon. We're not allowed to place retractors. We can hold them, but we cannot actually put them in the patient. We can't suture. We cannot inject. We can't make an incision. Trying to think of what else in the OR we can't do. We cannot operate the X-ray machine, so which means even if everything is all set up and hooked up and it's in place and ready to go, we cannot push the button to shoot the X-ray because we are not trained to do so. It's outside of our scope of practice. Delegation. Delegation is basically you just telling somebody else to do something. But in order to do that, you have to know whether or not that person is actually trained and competent to do the task that you've delegated to them, or that they're even allowed to do it. Because you can delegate whatever you want to somebody. Like the surgeon telling us, the ST, hey, while I go and scrub my hands, why don't you go ahead and inject that local? He can tell us, he can try to tell us, but then we have to tell him back, I'm sorry, sir, I can't. That's outside of my scope of practice. So when you're delegating to somebody, you have to make sure that it's something that they actually are allowed to do, right? Like as an ST, you wouldn't tell an orderly, hey, go ahead and open up, my sterile items, right? That's beyond their scope of practice. They have not been trained in aseptic technique and how to open them properly and how to avoid contamination and things like that. So, and some of the things that may be delegated to us that is within our scope of practice is, going and picking up a patient from the floor, assisting the circulator, like, putting in a Foley catheter, prepping the patient, going down to SPD and, helping put instrument sets together, pick case cards, things like that. All those things can be delegated to us, and they are definitely within our scope of practice. Accountability. We've talked a little bit about this with you guys over the past couple of days, stemming from what happened with the student on Monday. But again, this is you, like if somebody delegates a task to you, asks you to go and do something, take full responsibility for getting that task accomplished, efficiently and correctly. Right? Like, and owning any kind of mistake that happens. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a mistake either. Like, own the success of it too. Like, if they delegate a task to you and you go and you get it done real quick and correctly and everything, and you come back looking for more to do, and they're like, wow, you don't have to be like braggadocious about it or anything like that. You don't have to, like, dust the dirt off your shoulders and be walking around like, yeah, I did that. But if somebody says, oh, hey, you did a great job there, thank you, something like that, and that's you just being accountable for even doing good work, right? But if something bad were to happen and somebody's like, hey, who put this thing in the substerile room? I did. Oh, well, it doesn't belong there or something like that. Oh no, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. Then you're having a conversation, and then they can show you what's going on. It's usually pretty much that simple. Is you just take accountability for anything that may happen, whether it's good or bad, and you just keep it moving, kind of thing. Now, even the hospitals and the healthcare facility, they get accredited by the Joint Commission. Right? These are the group of people that come in and they check over the whole hospital. They look at all your documentation, your protocols, all your policies, all that kind of stuff to make sure that you're doing things the right way as a hospital, that you're taking care of these patients, that you are cleaning these rooms, you're sterilizing your instrumentation, you're doing the things that you're supposed to be doing, that you're doing those things that are considered standard of care, right? That everyone across the country is supposed to be doing for patients, right? That you're giving new employees their orientations, and that your violation of these policies and everything that are being followed along in the correct disciplinary action, and people getting remediation and trainings and things that they need, just to make sure that patients are receiving the best care that they can. If the Joint Commission comes in and finds too many errors, then they will temporarily shut your hospital down until you get that stuff fixed. And then they come back out and check again to make sure you fixed all the things that were wrong. Which means if your hospital is shut down, you can no longer accept any new patients in. You got to take care of the ones that you still have, because you can't ship them off to somewhere or whatever. But you can't bring any new ones into the hospital. You can't do any new surgeries. So everything stops. The money that is coming into the hospital is no longer coming in, and they're just putting money out. So it's very beneficial to the hospital to stay on top of their standards and their regulations and stuff. Now, each profession has their own kind of standards and practices, right? You have the American Academy of Surgeons. You have AST, Association of Surgical Technologists. You have the AORN, which is the Association of Operating Room Nurses is what ARN stands for. They may have just now changed their name to Association of Perioperative Registered Nurses, the APRN. But all these standards and practices are based on how we've treated patients in the past. So, let's say, we brought a patient in the 1960s, and we did an exploratory laparotomy on them, and they stayed in the hospital for a few days or a week until they went home and were better. Well, as the years went on, we came with better techniques, laparoscopic type stuff. So maybe we don't have to do these exploratory laparotomies. These patients don't have to stay in the hospital as long, that kind of stuff. That was that evidence-based. That was the evidence is, look, we can do it like this now, and these patients do better. So then they started accepting those standards and practices because it was improvement for the patients and for the staff and things like that. So that's what we're talking about when we mean evidence-based. We think of something that we think might be better for patient care. We implement it, we put it into practice, and we keep track of, okay, how well is this really working? And if it's really working well, then we make it the new standard of care. If it's not working really, then we get rid of it, go back to what we were doing before until we can come up with something that may be better to replace it in the future. Your code of conduct, right? This is how we act, right? These are rules written down to saying, hey, this is the way you need to behave. If you don't behave like this, then we can potentially terminate your employment. Right? Honesty, professionalism, compassion, and integrity. Right? If you're dishonest, if you lie a lot, then they can't trust you around patients, because say that somebody thinks that you possibly contaminated something and they ask you, hey, did that touch this? And you're not honest, and you saw it touch it, but you don't want to have to replace it and go through all the hassle of having to do all that, and you say, oh, no, it's fine. Now you've put the patient at risk. If you come in and you're not professional, you're calling doctors by their first names, and you're just kind of like, whatever, and you have no real professionalism to your job and to your demeanor and stuff like that, then you start to lose a little bit of trust from people, especially in the operating room. They don't know if they can really trust you to be around these patients. If you don't really have compassion for patients, that's another thing, right? It's really big in the healthcare industry, because for a lot of people, they work in this field because they have kind of a calling to it, right? They're compassionate people. They feel sorry for people who are sick and injured and are going through something, and they want to do something to help them, right? Some other people are just in this field for the money, and you will see, and it will show in people. You will see who's there for just the money or their own gains, and who's there to actually take care of the patients. Integrity, that's that doing something right and doing it the right way, whether or not there's somebody standing over your shoulder watching you, making sure you're doing it the right way. And these four, the honesty, professionalism, compassion, and integrity, all together is what really builds trust in the operating room, in each other, in our teams. When a doctor walks in the room and you've been exemplary in these four categories every time you've worked with them, they're going to be nothing but happy to see you. They're going to be, oh, great, because when you're exuding these four things, you're also engaged in the surgery. You're on point with what's going on. You're never just stopped and because these four things are what's driving you in here. And it's making you want to learn It's making you want to see what's going on. It's making you want to pay attention to the surgery so that you can anticipate and you can do your job better. And then the patient can get better faster. Everything you're doing is for that patient. Right? Now, just remember, the code of conduct, it's not a law. Right? So even if you break one of these, behavioral or conduct things, you're not going to go to jail. You're not going to get, fined or something like that. But like I said, you may get fired or written up. You may get fired or written up or something. Some form of like disciplinary action may come of it. Certification, licensure, and registration. Something that you definitely need to know the difference between the three. Certification is a test that you take to say that you are competent in the thing you took a test on. Now, for example, for us, that's the certification, the ST certification exam you take at the end of your program here, right? And that gets you with that piece of paper, that certification, after you take that test and pass it. Now you can walk around and say, yes, I am a surgical technologist and I took this test to show that I know what I'm doing. Right? And that shows your employers. You can give them that piece of paper and they're like, okay, because the certification test is just kind of like a standard, right? If you know at least this information and can pass this test, then you can perform here as a surgical tech. Now, licensure. Now, this is something that is required by the state. And it's all states. Like certification, maybe in some states, but not in all states. Is it required? So it's something that you can or don't necessarily have to get depending on the state you live in. But licensure, you have to have a license to be able to work in the capacity, of whatever that is. Obviously, doctors have to be licensed. Nurses, radiology techs, respiratory therapists, they all have to take a licensure exam, which then also carries with it a registration. You have to be registered in the state so that they keep a list of those people who are nurses, doctors, respiratory therapists, radiology techs, and everything like that, and they keep a copy of your license on record and like when it's due to expire and all that kind of stuff, because they need to monitor these particular healthcare professionals, because these particular healthcare professionals have access to very dangerous or potentially harmful, if abused, like medications and drugs and things like that. Doctors and nurses have access to, whatever, morphine, cocaine, succinylcholine, propofol, all those kinds of things, right? Respiratory therapists have access to, like bronchodilators and, those kind of things to help expand, lung and breathing and things like that, things that are controlled type substances. And then your radiology techs, if you're working like in nuclear medicine or something like that, you have access to those radiologic, medications and things like that, things that are giving off radiation and can cause, cancer if in normal healthy people, stuff like that. So they need to be able to keep an eye on and know who has the access to these things, and they need to know them by like their name and how to get a hold of them and things like that, in case something were to happen at a facility where something went missing or was abused or something like that. Then they have a list of names that they can go to and talk to and find out what's going on. These legal doctrines. So these are things that we have kind of in place in the healthcare field, and definitely memorize all four of these. You're going to see all four of these again. You'll probably see them on the quiz, but you'll definitely see one to all four of them on your certification exam. The respondet superior, right? This is what it directly means is let the master speak. It's Latin for let the master speak. What it means is that your employer is responsible for the employee's actions. And in the case of the operating room, it's the surgeon is like the master in the room. He's the one that's running everything. So ultimately, if something were to happen, ultimately that responsibility lies with the surgeon. Res ispa loquitur is the thing speaks for itself. What this means is, uh, like, let's say you have a child. You only have one child, right? You have no pets, nothing like that, or whatever. And there's a lamp in the living room that is broken. You know you didn't do it. You didn't know your significant other didn't do it. And since you have no other pets or anything like that, you only have the one child. There's no one else in the house that could have done it, right? That's what it means by the thing speaks for itself. You're like, well, I didn't do it. And he didn't do it. You're the only one left. You must have done it. Right? Primum non nocere, nocere is first do no harm. Right? That's one of the things that we're looking at when we are taking care of a patient. We don't want to do anything that's going to harm the patient. And then the doctrine of detrimental reliance. This is the first time I've heard of this. This must be relatively new. Um, but the responsibility for injury can be deflected to you, to us, the ST, if we are the ones who did something like negligent or purposefully did something to injure that patient. Hang on one second. Sorry, I gotta plug in my laptop. Battery's gonna die. But if we did something that was just, egregious or completely outside of our scope of practice, and we knew it was, then we can be held responsible. Um, an incident or a sentinel event is when either the patient or usually it's the patient when we're talking about a sentinel event, um, or like an incident report or something like that. Something has happened to the patient that wasn't supposed to. Right? Either they died in the OR, and there was, they shouldn't have. Obviously, we do not typically want or not necessarily want. We don't typically allow the patient to die in the operating room. Sometimes it does happen, but if they start going downhill and the surgery isn't going to help them or anything like that, we'll just kind of stop the surgery, close them up, and get them over to the ICU or something like that, and then they die in the ICU. Or if the patient is harmed in some way, some kind of injury occurs, wrong site surgery, where they come in to have their left leg amputated and we accidentally take off their right. That's a sentinel event. If a death or some kind of injury happens to the patient, unintended, obviously, because making an incision is injuring the body technically, but it was an unintended injury, then those are considered uh, sentinel events. Sentinel events are a very big deal. There's a lot of investigation that goes into those, uh, and there's a lot of policies and procedures that get made to avoid sentinel events. Um, the ER or the ECRI Institute here, uh, they're the authority on patient safety, and then all of the incident reports and sentinel events and all those get reported to the ECRI through our risk management department. Risk management, they're the department that goes around looking and making sure that if there's somebody just mopped the floor, but they didn't put out a wet floor sign. They're looking for all kinds of risks around the hospital. A piece of the flooring that's chipped off or something like that could cause a trip. And definitely the policies and procedures that happen on the floors and things like that, and patient falls, all that kind of stuff is under the umbrella of risk management. And they're always constantly doing risk assessments, making sure that there's no potential for injuries or harm or anything like that in the hospital. Torts, right? There's two different kinds. You have an intentional tort and an unintentional tort. Now, a tort itself is like you see here, it's a civil wrong. Right? You did something to someone else. Right? You're either doing it against that person or their property. Right? The intentional ones is you did it on purpose, right? And whether it's theft or violence or whatever, it was purposeful in its nature. Right? And then there's unintentional torts where you didn't mean for something to happen to that person or their property, but it happened anyway because there was something that you didn't do, or something that you did resulted in that, and you weren't aware that that's what was going to happen. Negligence is an example of you not doing something that you were supposed to do. Right? Were you supposed to sterilize those instruments? Or yes, or were you trained to know that a hole in a wrapper means that instrument is contaminated and you shouldn't use it, but you just put it up anyway? And you were negligent, or you didn't check the package and you didn't see the hole. That's more negligence, is you just didn't check it, you didn't see the hole, but then it was still used on the patient, and the hole was found afterwards. So malpractice is a form of negligence, but malpractice is you knew you weren't supposed to do that, and you went and did it anyway. Retained objects, that's sponges, needles, instruments, a watch, right? Whatever you leave something inside the patient that wasn't there when we opened them up, that's negligent, right? Because we have protocols in place for counting and making sure we don't leave anything behind, right? A burn, a patient being burned, whether it's a chemical burn or an electrical burn or an actual fire. Right? A patient falls. A patient should never fall in the hospital anywhere, because there should always be like a wet floor sign. Or if that patient has trouble walking on their own, then there should be a hospital staff member, whether it's a nurse or an orderly or a tech or somebody with them when they're out walking. Or they should have assistive devices, things like that. Improper positioning. That's why we train you guys on how to position these patients and pad these bony prominence areas and things like that to prevent patient injuries. right? And if we're not doing what we were trained to do, now we're being negligent. Do we have the right patient? Are we working on the right site? Right? Did we mess up and give the wrong medication or too much of a medication because we didn't do our math quite right when we were mixing stuff up? Things like that. Abandonment, just leaving a patient by themselves somewhere. Right? That could potentially turn into the falls and things like that because we've walked away from them. Also, abandonment in the operating room is, let's say you and the surgeon are having an argument and you're fed up with it and you just want to leave and get away from this argument. You can't, because that's considered patient abandonment. You have a job to do for that patient. So you got to stay and deal with whatever's happening or get somebody to relieve you. You can't just walk out of the room. Failure to communicate. That's a form of negligence, right? That keeping information from somebody. Hey, I had to take that one instrument that you needed for your next case because this doctor over here needed it. As soon as I'm done with it, I can get it back to you, but you don't tell them anything. And now that person's searching forever and they go to start their case. And the surgeon who was using it, they don't know anything of that's going on. And the surgeon who needed it, he doesn't know that it's now in use by somebody else. So he thinks everything can just move along, right? They're wondering why this patient's in the room and asleep and everything when you don't have all of the supplies and stuff we need. Why wasn't he told? Things like that. Right? Loss or damage to the patient's property. This is like if a patient comes in with dentures and we take them out, we lose them. There's a protocol. Those dentures are supposed to go into a cup with a lid, and then a patient sticker goes on that container. And then that container stays with the patient's chart. Same thing with like their glasses or any jewelry, their clothes. Right? Because when they first get into pre-op, we have them completely get undressed and put on the patient gown, right? Hearing aids. What else? Dentures, hearing aids, glasses, jewelry, their personal property, right? If we lose that, because sometimes that can happen too, right? The patient comes in to the operating room on a gurney, but while we're doing the procedure, the doctor decides because we found something a little more complicated or we had to do a little bit more or whatever, that he's going to want that patient to stay the night. So they switch the gurney out for a regular hospital bed, but they forget to take the bag of the patient's stuff out from underneath the gurney and switch it over to the bed. And now that gurney goes back to either pre-op or gets taken over to the ER to be used in the ER or something like that. And now that bag of stuff is kind of gone. Right? Also, and here lastly on the slide, but don't think of it as being kind of insignificant because it's last on the list. This is actually the most important thing that we do as STs. It's specimen handling. Because let's say we take something out of a patient and we don't get what that doctor wants it labeled as. What do you want to call this specimen? Portion of liver, portion of sigmoid colon, whatever it is, right? If we don't get the proper name for it or what it's supposed to be, and we send that to pathology, now they can't make a good diagnosis on what they're seeing because they don't know what the tissue is, where it came from, what area of the body, right? So now they've got to do some investigating and things like that. Another thing about specimens is, what if we put it in the wrong, liquid to help preserve it? Or it was something that we didn't want to put it in any kind of liquid, but then we did, and now we've destroyed some of that tissue. That's going to make diagnosing this patient much more difficult. May lead to another surgery where now we got to take more tissue. Very bad thing. So that's why specimen handling is the most important thing that an ST does. The most important thing is handling the specimens. I know some of you might want to think that, well, what about maintaining our sterile field and aseptic technique and all important things? Yes, very important things, and all things that we do on a daily basis. But the specimen is the most important because the potential for much more harm done to the patient because of incorrect specimen handling is so great, so great. So specimens, most important. Malpractice. Now, this is something that's typically done by a professional, right? Because we have been trained specifically to do specific things. And if we aren't doing those specific things, we are not following the protocols of what we were trained to do. Right? But these four elements have to be proven in order for it to be considered malpractice, right? There has to be a duty to a patient. What is our duty to our patient? Maintaining that sterility, right? Following our aseptic techniques, handling their specimens right? Monitoring sterility, correcting any breaks in technique, things like that, right? Then they have to be able to prove that you breached that duty by not meeting a standard of care, by not doing what you were supposed to be doing. Then they've got to show that that breach of your duty caused an injury. And then also that resulted in some kind of damage to the patient, whether by the injury or causing them to have now multiple surgeries, things like that. The plaintiff must prove it. Who's the plaintiff? Some of you may be old enough for People's Court. Others may have no idea who Judge Wapner is. But the plaintiff is the person who's bringing forward the accusation against someone else. Right? In most cases, for malpractice, the plaintiff is going to be the patient. They're the ones who are saying this doctor or this nurse or whatever, this is what they were supposed to be doing, and they didn't do those things, or they did this instead, and that resulted in this happening to me and this kind of damage. Right? But the plaintiff is the person who brings forth the accusation. The defendant is the person who is now defending themselves against that accusation. A subpoena. A subpoena is something like a written paper that, like, let's say I got a subpoena. That subpoena would say, I have to appear in court. That is a judge's order telling me that I have to appear in court at whatever day and time it says on the piece of paper for, whatever the suit may be. Right? That's you being summoned to the courtroom. And if you ignore the subpoena, then you can get held to legal action because you were ordered by a judge. If you don't follow the orders of a judge, you can be in big, big trouble. A deposition, this is where you can meet, and it doesn't have to be in a courtroom, but you meet with lawyers from both sides of the litigation that's going on, both the lawyers for the plaintiff and defendant. And then you can give your testimony as to the events, the things that happened, right? And it's usually both sides are asking you questions about the incident that took place, and you're just being honest and telling them, what happened. And you're sticking to the facts. You're not trying to throw in any, opinions or anything like that, or what you think that this or that should have happened, or this you think this person could have done something else or whatever. It's always the facts, right? That's a deposition. I have actually been called in for a deposition one time in my career. And it's not that big of a deal. You just answering the questions of the lawyers to the best of your ability. Perjury. Who knows what perjury is? Perjury is lying under oath. That's where you put your hand on the book and you say that, I swear to tell the whole truth, or the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right? And if you lie, either in a deposition or in a courtroom, you can be found in what's called contempt of court and actually face charges of perjury and lying in court. So, intentional torts. Right? This is you doing something purposefully against someone else, right, or against their property. Things like invasion of privacy, defamation, sexual harassment, assault and battery. Talk a little bit about some of these. In the healthcare setting, an invasion of privacy, an example of that would be, let's say that you heard your neighbor had gone to the ER. And now you go into the computer system and look up why they're in the ER. You have no business in that patient's record. And just because they're your neighbor and you're curious, that's not a reason, right? You purposely went in trying to get some information to find out something. Those are HIPAA violations. Immediate termination if you're found to be in violation of someone's privacy. Defamation. Who knows what defamation is? This is attacking someone's character. Right? There's two different types of defamation. There's libel and slander. Slander is when you say it. It's spoken, right? Dr. Gomez is a punk. Right? That's defamation. You guys don't know who Dr. Gomez is. You could love Dr. Gomez, right? And I'm defaming his character by what I'm saying. Right? Libel is you doing the same thing. You're defaming their character, but this time you're writing it, putting it in writing. You're writing it down. Sexual harassment, obviously that's intended. Right? Even if what you think, wasn't your intention, like when you were telling the joke or when you were saying, hey, sweetheart, or I call everybody sweetheart or whatever, it's still considered intentional. You shouldn't be calling anybody sweetheart except for your sweetheart. Assault and battery. Okay. So, what's the difference between assault and battery? So, the way to remember these two is typically they go together, right? You hear somebody got charged with assault and battery, things like that. Occasionally, you'll hear that someone just gets charged with battery, and you're like, I thought those two went together. Well, assault is you threatening or trying to hurt someone else, but you haven't really hurt them. You didn't make any contact with them. Right? That's assault. You're threatening them. That's you kind of like, or acting like you're going to throw a punch, right? You'd like bring your hand up, or even me, right? Doing like this. That could be considered assault, right? This could be a threat. I'm threatening my students with backhanding them across the head when they don't do what they're supposed to do. Right? Battery is when you actually make contact with the intent to injure somebody. Right? So the way to remember it is with assault, you're just salty, right? You're just spitting a bunch of venom. You're upset and you're like, I'm going to get you and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that and you're going to regret it. And all you're doing is just talking. You're just being salty. Battery is when you take a bat and actually hit them. Right? So battery is when you hit with a bat. Assault is you're just salty. Hopefully that kind of helped on some of that. Documentation. Absolutely required in all areas of medicine. There's a saying that if you don't document it, it didn't happen. And that's how it goes in a court of law. That you could be in there, giving testimony whether at the deposition or actually in the courtroom, um, and telling the events or the account of the events that went on, and it doesn't match what's written down in the documentation. Well, they can't just take your word for it. They go by whatever is written in the chart. And let's say you tell them, then I applied the tourniquet. Well, according to the chart here, there was no tourniquet on the patient. And you're like, well, I know I absolutely did put a tourniquet on that patient, but it was never charted. So in the eyes of the law, it never happened. And of course, HIPAA, that's what HIPAA stands for, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. But there's no, you notice in the title, privacy is not there. Right? This is the health insurance portability. That means who has access to it, right? Who can you give it to? How can you transmit it around? And then accountability is what we're going to do to you if you abuse these privacies, right? If you use this information for things you're not supposed to be using it for. Here's some of the documentation that you'll see out there, and like Privacy Act type stuff that can't be really shared unless it's with somebody that is involved directly with that patient's care, right? You got like name and address, date of birth, social, their medical record numbers, anything that you can use, any number or a piece of information that you can use that can link you back to that person. Right? Like I could take somebody's social security number, just a number, and then find out who they are, where they live, that kind of, get all their pertinent information, all their private information. I can do the same thing with their medical record number if I just know how to get into the system. I can do it with their license plate or certification numbers or bank account numbers, email address, all that can be tracked and find out like who that person is and potentially steal an identity or something like that, right? There are some guidelines for documentations, especially there's a list of abbreviations in your book. On page 38, I believe, in chapter 3, there's a table, 3.1. Those lists of abbreviations are a do not use list because there was confusion in the past where somebody used an abbreviation and then somebody came behind them, like a doctor wrote something down in the chart, giving order to a nurse to administer some kind of medication, and the abbreviation that they used, when the nurse came back and read it, they thought that abbreviation meant something else. And so they weren't necessarily following the exact orders that the doctor had left. So that's why they came up with this list of abbreviations that you do not ever use because there's too much potential for patient harm. Every document that's going to be in that patient's chart should have a patient sticker on it that's got their name, date of birth, medical record number, all that kind of stuff. The date has to be accurate, right? Because if your date is off, then you're saying that things happened. Like let's say the patient went in on April Fool's Day to have their procedure done, but you marked everything down as March 31st. Or let's say you were marking everything as April 1st, but you were marking it as 2020 and not 2021. Well, everything that has that date on it didn't actually happen in the eyes of the law because the documentation is incorrect. So what else on that piece of paper can be incorrect? See what I'm saying? That's kind of how legally they go down these roads. Right? If there is an error, all you do is you just make one line through it, write the correction, and then you're going to initial where you made the line through the error. Has to be done in black ink and legible, right? You have to be able to read it. And you just, and documentation, we don't typically do a lot of documentation as the ST. Um, but you want to stay, brief with your wording. Right? You don't need to write out like this whole long thing. And a lot of times you're not using a bunch of like the and ands. You're not using like those articles and helping verbs and stuff like that. It's just patient prepped, nipple line to hips or to iliac crest, and bedside to bedside. Well, that's how when you're documenting something, right? Tourniquet applied to upper part of lower left extremity. Right? Just quick little boom, and then as they can read it, they go, okay, good, good. Somebody can follow along too. You definitely want to use the correct language, correct spelling of things too. Spelling does count. Um, you always want to log off your computer, and this is something for us STs too, because when you get your job and you're working and stuff like that, you're going to have to do these what are called they call them different at every place or whatever, but they're like these online learning things that you do, and they're these little presentations that you go through. It takes you, some of them are quick, others take a little while or whatever. Uh, but they're like your annual competencies and things like that. They're for like your fire safety and all that things that you have to complete annually to stay, eligible to work and for the hospital to get us accreditation and things like that. But you're going to have to log on to a computer. You're going to have computer access and a log on and stuff. So when you go to walk away from that computer, make sure you log off so that nobody can come in behind you and get into patients' charts and that kind of stuff. And then always there has to be a signature so that they know, who put in that note or who completed that document, things like that. So they can go back to if there's any errors and things like that. But these are a lot of the common types of documents that you're going to see. The patient's medical record, obviously their whole chart. Within that chart, you're going to find the informed consent. The informed consent is a document that the patient and the surgeon, there'll be 3 signatures on it: the patient's, the surgeon's, and then a witness, usually a patient family member or something like that. This document states that the patient and the surgeon have had a conversation about the procedure that they're going to do, and they've talked about all the risks and the benefits associated with this surgery, all the potential complications, everything that could go right, everything that could go wrong, and that the patient has agreed to allow the surgeon to perform the surgery, even after hearing all the stuff that could happen or not happen or whatever. And then the patient signs it saying that they understand, and that's what gives us the right to actually cut this patient and do the things we need to do to fix them and stuff like that, to do surgery on them. If we do not have that piece of paper, and it is not signed by the patient, then we are performing battery on that patient as soon as we cut them. They did not give us permission to do so. Then you have an intraoperative record. This is the document that tells everything that we did during the surgery. From what we prepped, where we put the EKG pads. Did we put in an ET tube or an LMA, or is this local or a spinal? Did we put a tourniquet on? How did we position the patient? Where did we put the Bovie pad? Everything that we did. Right? What time did the surgery start? What time did the surgery end? What dressings did we put on? Did we complete the counts? Everything goes into that record. Anesthesia has their own document that they mark down how they were monitoring the vital signs. What were the vital signs at these certain intervals of time? And it's usually every about, I think, 10 to 15 minutes that they have to document on their piece of paper what the patient's vital signs were. What was the O2 sat? What was their temperature? What was their blood pressure? What was their heart rate? And you write all that in there. What size ET tube did you use? Right? Were there any loose teeth? That kind of thing. Then there's also the patient charges, which means everything that we open onto the field, the patient has to pay for. So we have to take that, the package from it and mark down in their chart that it was used on their procedure, so that they can compile a list of things to give the patient, their bill. Birth and death certificates. Right? If you did a C-section, there's a birth certificate. If a patient dies in the OR or something like that, then there'll be a death certificate that has to get filled out too. Typically, it's the hospitals who issue a birth or death certificate, and then they get certified by the county that hospital resides in. And then specimen and pathology records, right? We have to label those specimens, and we have to label the document that we're writing all this down on, so that pathology has the piece of paper and the specimen, so they can connect them two together, right? They can give them, special instruction on the paper, things like that. But it's so that we can track, where these things are, where they're going, and who they belong to, and stuff like that. Oh, see, I did it again. I started talking about all these things, and there's a slide for them. But here's that informed consent, right? Legal document signed prior to us doing surgery. Right? What the surgeon and the patient have talked about, all their risk and benefits and potential outcomes, any alternatives that they might be able to do. For like liposuction now, they can do that alternative, that cool sculpting, so then you don't even have to have surgery. And then does the patient understand the procedure? Do they know what we're doing to them? And that's usually a conversation that when the nurse goes over to have their pre-op interview before they wheel them back to the OR, they talk about, they ask them, do you know what you're having done today? And if they tell you the medical word for it, then you might want to ask, well, you know what that means? And if they're like, oh, no, not really. You're like, and that starts to raise red flags, because if they don't have an understanding of what's going on, but they sign the document anyway, we can still get in trouble for that, or at least the surgeon can. Because then afterwards they can say, well, I didn't fully understand what was going on. And they, well, you signed the informed consent. Well, they just told me that this is, and then things can happen. So, and that leads them to kind of an acceptance of the procedure. Right? If they have that understanding of what's going to be going on, and they understand all the risks and benefits involved, and what the potential outcomes and stuff, then typically they're going to be, yeah, go ahead and giving us that permission. Right? Oh, incident reports or sentinel events. Right? An incident report is, maybe the patient got harmed, but it didn't lead to like a life-changing kind of thing. Like we didn't cut off the wrong limb or something like that. The piece of mesh potentially that we used was expired, and we didn't notice it until it was up on the field and we had started suturing it in or something like that. That would be an idea or an example of an incident report. Because we would take that out and get a piece that wasn't expired, so we wouldn't leave an expired piece in. But these reports, they stick to the facts, right? Give me the who, what, where. The who, where, when, and how. That's it. That's all they want. And then the question arises like, when should we do these reports? As soon as it happens, immediately, or immediately, like if you're still involved with the case and taking care of the patient and things like that, then as soon as you have the ability to, as soon as you're done helping take care of that patient or whatever, that report needs to be done as close to the time of the incident happening, so that all of these facts are still fresh in your mind. When filling out a report like this, you never interject your opinion. You never say what you think might have happened or what you think this is what this person intended or anything. It's just, this is who was involved, this is where it happened, this is when it happened, and this is how it happened. or what happened. Right? The how and the what are kind of together. Your incident report, right? Facts only, right? No opinions. Using that professional language. You can only talk from the first person. Things that you saw, you experienced. Right? Don't be intimidated by it. Don't let somebody come over and tell you, oh, you shouldn't be, or why are you filling that out? And then you kind of tell them a little bit about what happened and like, oh, you don't need to fill one of those out. And yes, you do. If there was an incident, a patient got harmed, or there was a potential for harm or something like that, this needs to be done so that we can address it, so that it doesn't happen again in the future. Take your time. Make sure you're getting all the facts in there. And then you're going to submit that to the OR director, who's then going to take it to risk management. The report that you do fill out can be subpoenaed and used in the court case. It is a legal document at that point. So, these advanced healthcare directives, what we're talking about in here is like power of attorneys, living wills, DNRs, things like that. DNR means do not resuscitate. That means no CPR, right? No chest compressions or any of that stuff. No, if I flatline and go like dead, basically, you're not allowed to bring me back. And you can have that order on your chart. Now, because there's two different kinds of DNRs. There is a DNR, which is do not resuscitate, and there is a DNAR, which is do not attempt resuscitation. If you have a DNR and you're on the floor, they won't do anything. If you have a DNR and you're in the operating room, we will bring you back, because your DNR does not apply to the operating room. That's why you get the DNAR if you don't want resuscitation to happen even in the operating room. We do not like patients to die in the OR. It does happen from time to time, but we are still going to try to bring them back. The reason being is that before the patient went to sleep, all the information we have, the informed consent, all interactions with that patient have told us that they want to have this surgery done and they want to wake up, because anesthesia has their own talk with them too, and they fill out an anesthesia consent form, but they want to wake up. So that is why we do resuscitative efforts in the OR and do like a code blue and run all that to get them back, because the DNR is kind of, if they started to go down and die on their own, like on the floor or something like that, that was of their own free will. If it's happening in the operating room, it may be a result of something that we're doing to the patient. We're putting them under kind of a stress. So that's why we bring them back. If they have a DNAR, which is do not attempt resuscitation, we can't touch them, even in the operating room. If they code, we just have to hands off and hope that they come back on their own. Organ donation, right? You can refuse or agree to be an organ donator. And some people have it on their driver's license. Sometimes in the hospital setting, they'll even ask you, and then if you say yes or whatever, they'll bring you the paperwork to sign and fill out. And I think if you say no, there may be even paperwork you have to fill out for that too. That way it's on file that you said no. Refusal of blood or tissue products, right? You don't want a cadaver graft, like a bone or an ACL or anything like that. Or you don't want a blood transfusion. Typically, these are faith-based or religious regions. Right? Jehovah's Witness is an example of blood refusal. The Jehovah's Witness religion sees blood transfusions as you taking in like dirty blood. And now you're not worthy of going to heaven. That's kind of how they see it. So and you get, and there has been times where Jehovah's Witnesses and have come in unconscious, trauma style, and they've given them blood transfusions because they didn't know, and they were trying to do everything to save that patient's life. And those people afterwards, and they get told it's part of their chart and everything like that, that they were given blood and stuff like that, and they have to go back and tell their religious leaders, and they get like basically kind of like excommunicated through no fault of their own. A living will specifies what kind of medical intervention that you want done or don't want done, right? And a living will doesn't necessarily have to be in the hospital. You can have that done outside of the hospital too and bring it in with you. A medical power of attorney, this is you designating somebody, a loved one or a friend or whatever, to make medical decisions for you if you're ever incapacitated and can't make them for yourself, right? Usually a living will and a power of attorney will go kind of hand in hand. You can have the living will on file and then give power of attorney to somebody, but in order for your living will to still be followed by your medical power of attorney, by the person that you put in charge of your medical decisions, then you have to designate that in the power of attorney. You have to tell them and put it in that piece of paper that, yes, they get to make decisions based on my medical care, but they have to follow these guidelines. Because if you don't put those guidelines in there, you gave them the ability to say, go ahead and pull the plug, or don't pull the plug. Right? Let's say you in your living will, you're like, I don't want to be intubated. I don't want to live. I don't want to be alive like that. And then something happens, and now you can't speak for yourself, and the power of attorney kicks in for them. They have full autonomy. They can do whatever because they are now acting on your behalf, and whatever decisions they make that's it. It's solid. The living will is different from the advance directive. Is that the advance directive is for your hospital stay only. The advance directive does not carry outside of the hospital. The living will does. The living will is for wherever you are in the world at any given moment. An advance directive is for that particular hospital stay that you're there at that moment. Ethics, we talked about ethics a little bit already. Medical ethics, right? There's standards of conduct, right? That honesty and integrity, things like that. And those go same into the professional ethics, right? Certain professions have a little bit different, but also understand the difference between ethics and morals. Ethics is usually defines your behavior in regards to your relationship with other people and your environment, right? Your morals are more of a personal standard, right? Ethics is something that's being kind of put on you externally, and then you're coping with that way. Morals come from you and inside, right? How your experiences, your growing up, that kind of stuff. These are some of our ethical behaviors in healthcare, right? These are our directives, are the things that we should be doing for patients, right? Respecting individuals, doing no harm, act with beneficence. Do you know what that means? With like care and compassion, kindness, right? Act with justice, do what's right. Even when everyone else is telling you no, do what's right. Respect all those confidences that were put to you, right? Those things that are within your scope of practice, the things you were trained to do. Act in good faith. Go in, hey, I have utmost intention of doing all of this, correctly, and because mistakes can be made, and it's understood that mistakes can be made. We're all human, but as long as you went into it with good faith, you didn't go into it purposely trying to do something bad. Right? Being honest, putting the patient first, respecting, someone's individual will. They have the right to refuse at any time, even if they sign that consent form and they're laying on the operating room table and they're like, yeah, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. Hey, they're saying they don't want to do it. Yes, we can have a conversation, but if they are adamant about they don't want to, okay, case is canceled, we're done here. You don't want to do it, you don't have to. Surgical conscience. This speaks to that accountability, responsibility. Right? This is you knowing what's right and doing what's right because it is right, especially in the operating room. The surgical conscience also it ties very, very closely to aseptic technique. This is you doing what's right and having that integrity no matter what. If you know that your glove is contaminated, that's you're calling yourself out, even if nobody saw you. You're like, my hand touched the IV pole. Can somebody come take my glove off? And can I get a new glove? It's not really that big of a deal. Really, it isn't. Nobody's going to say anything to you negatively if you contaminate yourself. Now, if you keep doing it over and over and over again, somebody's going to be like, "Hey, come on, like that's not sterile. Stop touching it, or whatever, right? Or stay away from that thing." But like if it happens the first time and you call it, like, this got contaminated. Like, oh, okay, no problem. Here, let's switch out real quick. Good to go. And you'll never hear another word about it. And then that like a commitment to cost containment, right? You're not just opening a bunch of stuff and wasting things that aren't getting used or whatever because you think, oh, well, I think he's going to use this, so here. And then actually you get into the case and he's never used that for that procedure before ever. Impairment, right? Working under the influence of drugs or alcohol, obviously can lead to an injury of patient, right? You're compromised, your cognitive abilities are compromised, things like that. You're not thinking clearly. So you're not going to perform properly. There may be some cases out there that are in direct conflict with a religious view or one of your moral views or something like that, such as an abortion. Now, in the hospital setting, we don't do like elective abortions, but sometimes patients they'll have a miscarriage. They'll have a child who has some kind of genetic issue that is not going to be viable for life. So the patient, even the baby being born, it's not going to live, and so they perform, an abortion. You have every right to refuse those. You can be put on the list of people who don't do those cases. Right? Tubal ligations is another one. If you're Catholic and very devout Catholic, you may not believe in sterility. So that would be vasectomies and tubal ligations. You wouldn't do those procedures because of your religious beliefs, things like that. And then there also can be what's called staff shortages, where you could have 8 operating rooms, but at the moment you only have 6 surgical techs hired on. Right? You can't effectively run all 8 rooms. So you're running now 6 rooms, but you're running them late into the night. And you're kind of overworking your staff a little bit. Now they're coming in tired. And they're calling out sick a lot and stuff like that. Now your patient care is going to suffer because of it. Some dilemmas. The right for a patient to die. Some people are like, we should be doing everything that we can to save their life. Well, they don't want their life saved. Well, I don't think that's right. Okay? Stem cell research. Some people don't. They think that we're playing God. Right? doing stem cell research, and same thing with cloning. Right? Things they think that human beings shouldn't be involved with. Good Samaritan law. This is you walking down the street, you see somebody go down, you go to help provide some first aid or CPR or something like that, and the patient gets that particular person gets injured in your help with you trying to help. There's a law in place that kind of protects us. Hey, we were just trying to help. I was trying to do the best I could to help you. Right? I talked about abortions and elective sterilizations, genetic engineering. Right, this is going in and playing with people's genes to give you, blonde hair, or blue eyes, or maybe you want to have dark skin, things like that. Going in and changing DNA codes, human experimentation, things like that, like the human centipede. Right? Ethical type dilemmas. And some people might think, hey, these are good things. So other people might say, no, you're going down a dark path, going that way. There's so many problems. More fraud, in vitro fertilization, artificial insemination, gender reassignment, animal experimentation, organ donation, all this stuff that people are like, I don't know if that's right. Some people have certain views on things, and other people have opposite views. You just got to in the healthcare setting, you just got to kind of learn to live and let live. Right? You do you, you let them do them. You just focus on doing the job and taking care of the patient the best you can. Decision making and these ethical kind of questions just they come from like our own experiences, right, and our own morals, our own values, what we believe to kind of be right and things like that. It's going to be a little different for each person. Hey, as long as we're taking care of that patient to the best of our ability, that's all we can ask for. So I bet the big question is what's on the quiz, right? Um, so know some of the history of surgical technology, like what were surgical techs first called? What was the how did we come into being? Why did we come into being? What was the reasoning for it? Where did we get our start? Where did STs first appear? Kind of thing. Um, know your different agencies like AORN, AST, Joint Commission, that kind of thing, and what they regulate. Um, and who does accreditation for hospitals and who does accreditation for schools, right? Know the different agencies like KHEP, ARC, those kind of people, and what their roles are. Know who the NCCT is and what they do and how getting certification through them is different than through AST or NBSTSA. Excuse me. Know the differences between those two. Know the differences between licensure and certification. Know your Latin phrases, right? Those doctrines, the ager primo, the res ispa liquitor, and the respondent superior. Know those. Let's see. Know the different roles and the scope of practice of the ST, what we can and can't do. Know about power of attorneys, living wills, abandonment, defamation, and the two different kinds, libel and slander. Know about your torts, unintentional and intentional, sentinel events, your informed consent. Know the differences between a law, a regulation, and a policy. Know the differences between negligence and malpractice, or know that malpractice is an example of negligence, but be able to tell the difference between the two. Like what's a regular kind of negligence, and then what is malpractice? What constituted being malpractice? And then as far in communication, right, know about your sender receiver, your nonverbal communications, verbal communications like assertiveness, aggressiveness, things like that. And that should get you through the quiz. Let me stop sharing that so you don't see the actual quiz. And then for your matching, for the 10 matching, what you have is you're going to have a list of 5 things to choose from. The 5 things are yielding, change, politeness, collaboration, and conflict. And the 10 questions, it's going to give you like just a statement, and you're going to have to decide whether that statement goes into either yielding, change, politeness, collaboration, or conflict. Right. And that's everything you need to know for the quiz. Does anybody have any questions? Comments? Concerns? Clarifications? All right, don't forget if you think of something over the weekend or whatever, you can always text me in that group chat. I'd prefer it in that group chat for a question that you have, like about class or something like that. That way, that same question then can be answered for anyone else who might have that same question or give clarification to on something. Let's see, Monday, Group A is here at 9 o'clock in the morning. We're going to go up to the computer lab and do your student satisfaction surveys. And then that afternoon, we'll do the quiz. Remember, as soon as you're done with the quiz, you can log off and you can watch the lecture video. The lecture video should be available for you. I think I'll send it out in your guys' emails along with this video as soon as it's done compiling. So, and then on Tuesday, when Group B is here, we're going to go up to the computer lab at 9 also for Group B. And then for Group C, we'll go up to the computer lab at 2 p.m. to do your guys' student satisfaction surveys. And then next week, we're going to be doing open gloving and catheterization. We'll still be going over instrumentation, maybe run a couple more scrub wars kind of thing. But we're in it now, guys. 29 weeks left. All right. Well, you guys have a good weekend, and we will see everyone on Monday.